All right, what is up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to be doing a brief overview on editing this image primarily. This was taken during golden hour in the morning. It was like 40 something degrees outside. It doesn't look like it by the image, but it was really cold outside. So in a sense, what I was going for with this was more of a cinematic look, but also a very balanced aesthetic, but also maintaining like that automotive photography cinematic aesthetic to it too. The A series, this is basically an automotive preset line that I created from scratch. This photo isn't heavily saturated to go for like that cinema aesthetic where it's faded but not super overly saturated. Now, of course, as you can tell by the license plate, that orange is completely just blown out. I'm going to be actually cropping that out and removing the license plate itself for privacy's sake, right? I mainly do negative contrast to compensate with the clarity and the amount of details I can get back. I do some negative contrast to give it that slight fade look without actually doing a actual full-blown S-curve. I like to do that personally with my photography because it doesn't, in a sense, mess with the perceived clarity of the image, if that makes sense. And of course, I go through and then I mess around with the actual highlights and shadows, not to overemphasize the light source because this is like a sunrise behind some clouds, so it's not going to be overly saturated like it would be in direct sunlight. And then with the whites, I've completely crushed the whites to give it that more film-esque look, and then lifted the shadows a little bit, moving on to the color. In terms of color balance, I primarily did a slightly warmer edit. This matches the environment and gives it like a somewhat, not necessarily neutral color grade. It gives it more of an accurate in terms of color science of the actual raw scenery itself. Now, the actual unprocessed image is completely desaturated. If you saw this sunrise in person, like I did, this would probably be the most accurate representation of what the actual sunrise looked like. But if we go and we actually look at the raw original image, it just looks completely desaturated, which it completely does the actual overall scenery a disservice in terms of what your natural eyes would see. So what I like to do with a lot of my photography is actually make them as somewhat realistic to the scenery itself, that the way that I'm actually seeing it through my eyes, and not the way that the actual camera picks it up, because it looks completely desaturated, but the scene was actually very relatively orange. So that's the edit that I went with. Now, if we go over to the tints, now it does have a slightly tinted hue. With the green hue, it matches, it gives it like an odd offset to the amount of orange saturation that's in the image. So this is a slightly more modern color grade, for lack of a better term, to where some of the photography that you see nowadays with kind of more of a cinema-esque vibe to it, this gives it a somewhat more of a neutral-esque look because it complements the teals in the sky, but also doesn't overly saturate it and destroy the actual orange or affect how the orange is perceived during the actual sunrise. Now, of course, I did increase the vibrance. Common thing that a lot of photographers do is that they crush the saturation and they increase the vibrance. Usually it can go both ways. A lot of landscape photography that I've done, I've actually crushed the vibrance but increased the saturation a little bit to have a somewhat color accurate balance between the two. Now, of course, with this specific photo, I really wanted the oranges to pop and I wanted the teals to be slightly muted, but you can obviously tell it's a more cinematic teal and orange aesthetic, accurate to what you would see through, in a sense, like a movie screen. So I like to do negative texture. Specifically, it gives it that very silky smooth look to the photos, and then compensate that with a little bit of sharpening and a little bit of clarity if the image isn't as crystal clear. Of course, you can do selective edits. The way that I took this photo is I actually did not focus on the actual car itself. I focused on the actual mountain peak. So it's overly sharpened in my opinion, but when you zoom out and you look at this image, it seems relatively sharp. Now, of course, you could tell where the focus drops off at, right where the rear wheel is and the front wheel starts. And I shot this at f4. So, of course, if I actually shot it at f5.6, the car might have been just as sharp, but I didn't want the main subject to be the actual car. The car is just, in a sense, part of the storytelling process of where we, in a sense, park the car. And then, of course, the dehaze, depending on the environment, especially with this, it's similar. It's not super hazy, so the dehaze, I didn't really do too much stuff in terms of doing some severe dehazing. The main reason why I did the dehaze was just to bring the clarity out in the actual mountains themselves and the background, just to give it more of a pop. And then, of course, I added some vignette, and then midpoint to actually like really bring in the subject to be the actual main center of attention, rather than it just being everything in the photo and everything being all jumbled up. So that's the main reason why I did the midpoint all the way. Of course, feathering and the highlight compensation to make sure that it's relatively balanced and it's not going to be just like a photo with like really dark circles around the corners. It works for certain environments and certain aesthetics, but with this one primarily, I didn't want too much attention on the actual car itself, but mainly on the mountain peak. Now, of course, this photo, clarity with the photo at f4 with my current setup, the camera body wasn't, in a sense, picking up too much of the clarity, unfortunately, so I did have to do quite a bit of sharpening. And of course, I bumped up the radius. And then the masking, of course, to give it that very zoomed out but sharp look. I don't really like to do too much masking. I only do masking primarily with landscape photography, unless it's like an automotive photo of a car from very far away. Then I'll just do some masking so that it really draws the attention in. Of course, noise reduction, I didn't really do anything with the primary noise reduction option. I usually go straight for the actual color noise, and that, in a sense, helps out with the actual overall texturing of the image, and it helps make it a little bit more smooth rather than it being very gritty. And because this is a modern, clean color grade kind of aesthetic, rather than it being like a really dirty and gritty photo. For traditional off-road photography, you'd want some texture in the photo, and depending on what your vibe and aesthetic you're going for. So I left the smoothness all the way up just to make sure it's very like glossy-esque. And then that's primarily it. I mean, in terms of the actual selective color grading, I did the shadows in orange to make sure that it emphasizes that it's a sunrise, and then blended and then did a little bit of balancing. And then I left the midtones alone because the shadows and the highlights were exactly where they needed to be. I wanted the photo a little bit more orange than teal, so I left the midtones alone. I didn't really do anything with the midtones. And then with the highlights, did a slightly more teal, but I actually muted the teals. Back, if we go over to the actual teals, I muted the absolute crap out of the teals because I didn't want them messing around with the actual midtones of the image. So the mountains, they wouldn't have any teal at all. I didn't want that. And then with the actual blues, same thing goes for the blues. I didn't want them interfering with the general aesthetic of the image. Now, of course, with the purple and the violets, I didn't want them playing in at all. Primarily what I focused on was the reds and oranges and getting them somewhat balanced now. So either way, I'm going to be taking that and cropping it out either way. And then the oranges, of course, I did them slightly to the yellow, and then I actually did the yellow because the mountains were actually, originally the mountains are actually very yellow. So I tried to overcompensate with the oranges to make it a little bit more color accurate in terms of how the scenery was for the actual eyes, on how your eyes would see it. Overall, for the general aesthetic, I think it matches quite well. I'm actually satisfied with this color grade because it gives it that kind of like cinematic-esque look to it, but also gives it that slightly video game aesthetic too, in terms of like how they have those video game B-roll footage. So overall, that's basically how I edited this image. Now, of course, here's a quick before and after. Of course, the original image is completely desaturated, absolutely just overly bland for the aesthetic that I was trying to go for. I wanted to go for more of a dramatic cinematic effect. So this is the photo. This is what it looks like. Let me know what you guys think.